The headline hit like a broken cymbal in a quiet room. At 73, Sting finally names the bandmate from the police he really hates. 3 words, finally, names, hats, designed to make the world leaning because it sells a promise that feels irresistible. At behind one of the slickest, coolest bands of the late 20th century, there was a grudge so raw it survived decades. Tours, reunions, awards, and polished smiles, but the truth, like most truths that live inside fame, isn't they built for headlines? It's built for slow burns, for awkward silences, for memories that never got resolved, only managed that if you've ever watched footage of the police in their prime, you can almost feel it under the music. The precision is too sharp. The tension is too present. 3 men playing like a single organism, yet looking, at times, like they're trapped in a room together, each convinced the other 2 are breathing too loud, and that's what makes this story so unsettling. Because the police didn't they sound like a band having fun? They sounded like a band winning award. So when people read a line that suggests Sting hates one of his former bandmates, they don't ask if it's true. They ask which one. Andy Summers, the quiet architect with jazz in his hands and shadows in his chords, or Stuart Copeland, the volatile engine behind the kit, brilliant and combative, always pushing the tempo like he was trying to outrun his own anger. To understand why the world is so ready to believe that one of the most celebrated frontmen in modern music carries hatred in his back pocket, you have to understand what the police really was. Not 3 friends who made it big, but 3 strong wills forced into the same shape by ambition, demean, and an almost violent chemistry. Sting wasn't a born Sting. He was Gordon Sumner, a man who grew up with a certain kind of North of England grit, the kind that teaches you early that tenderness is expensive. Before the stadium lights, before the money, before the myth, he was a teacher. A regular life, structured, predictable, safe. But you don't become Sting because you love safe. You become Sting because something inside you refuses to accept a quiet ending. The police formed in a moment when punk had kicked the door open and everyone was trying to decide what to do with the mess. They weren't punk in the pure sense. They were something more dangerous for the era, disciplined. Musical. Clever. They could write hooks that wouldn't leave you alone, and they could play like they spent years learning how to hurt each other with sound. 3 men, 3 distinct languages. Sting wrote like a man who wanted control, over melody, over message, over his own image. It didn't just want to be in the band. It wanted the band to mean something in a way he could steer. Andy Summers played like a man who had already lived 3 lives before he walked into that room. Older than the others, seasoned, patient, and quietly stubborn. His guitar wasn't there to scream, it was there to haunt. And Stuart Copeland was the spark near the gasoline. The son of an intelligence officer, raised in motion, carrying a restlessness that turned into rhythm. It didn't just keep time. It provoked it. He was the kind of drummer who don't accept good enough, not because he's a perfectionist, but because he's addicted to momentum. Put those 3 together and you don't get peace. You get power, and power always comes with a price. In the beginning, the friction was part of the fuel. They were hungry, broke, and moving fast. When you're reclaiming, you can mistake conflict for passion. You can call it creative differences and laugh it off because the next gig matters more than the argument you're having in the van. But the higher you go, the more every disagreement becomes permanent. Because his success turns every choice into a legacy. Who wrote the song, who gets paid, who gets the interview question, who gets framed in the camera shot just a little longer. In bands, money don't just pay bills. Money keeps score, and the police was a band where the score mattered, even when no one admitted it. Over time, Sting became the primary songwriter. That wasn't a rumor. It was the structure. The songs carried his voice, his words, his melodic instincts. With each hit, his gravity increased, and the band's orbit tightened around him. That's how groups quietly collapse, not from one big betrayal, but from a slow shift in weight until one person feels like the sun and the others feel like satellites. Stuart Copeland wasn't built to be a satellite, Andy Summers wasn't either. Even if he carried it with more silence, and here's the part people miss when they reduce everything to hate, none of this requires hatred. It only requires ego, fear, and the crushing pressure of being trapped inside something that's working too well to walk away from. Because when a band becomes huge, you don't just quit the band. You quit a machine that feeds you, validates you, defines you. You quit the thing that tells the world who you are, and that kind of quitting don't feel like freedom. It feels like death. By the early 1980s, the police were no longer a rising act. They were the act. Arena level, global level, The kind of fame that makes you suspicious of every conversation because you can't tell who's speaking to you and who's speaking to your success. Behind the scenes, stories have long circulated, some told directly by the band members themselves over the years, about arguments, about the atmosphere in the studio, about moments when being in the police didn't they feel like brotherhood, it felt like endurance. There have been accounts of physical scuffles in the early days, of screaming matches, of resentment building with every session, and if you listen closely to those accounts, a pattern emerges. The most explosive fault line wasn't it between Sting and Andy. It was between Sting and Stewart, not because one was good and the other was bad, but because they were too similar in the way that ruins people. Both wanted to lead. Both were intensely intelligent. Both had a vision. And neither enjoyed losing. In most bands, the drummer is the heartbeat in the back. In the Police, the drummer was a co-pilot who wanted his hands on the wheel. Stewart Copeland brought ideas. He brought arrangements. He brought opinions, strong ones, and he wasn't shy about pushing them into the room. Sting, meanwhile, wasn't just defending a song. He was defending authorship, identity, the feeling that this band was the vessel for what he was trying to become. When you put that kind of ambition in a room with loud drums and louder egos, you don't get calm discussions. You get battles disguised as rehearsals, and still, they made masterpieces. That's the part that makes the story feel cursed. Their dysfunction didn't stop them. It sharpened them. Every tight guitar stab, every unexpected rhythmic turn, every lyric that feels like it's both seducing you and warning you, those bits they created in comfort. They were created in a pressure cooker. So what happens when the pressure cooker works? You keep turning up the heat, until something cracks. By the time they were making their biggest records, the band's interpersonal dynamic had become legendary. Three men who could barely stand being in the same room, yet were building something that millions of people treated like the soundtrack of their lives, and that contradiction does something to you. It makes you feel trapped by your own talent. It makes you resent the thing you're good at, because the world demands you keep doing it, even if it's killing you. When the Police finally stopped, when the band effectively ended after their peak, it wasn't a dramatic "we hate each other" press conference. It was more like a door shutting slowly. The kind of ending that happens when everyone is too exhausted to even fight about the ending. Sting went on to a wildly successful solo career. He reinvented himself in a way that, to some people, felt like an escape. To others, it looked like abandonment. The band that helped build the legend was now the thing he had to outgrow. For Stewart and Andy, it wasn't that simple. Being in a band that defines an era leaves a mark. When the singer becomes a global solo icon, the remaining members live in a strange shadow, still famous, still respected, but constantly introduced as part of the past. That's not a wound that heals easily. And now we return to the headline. At 73, Sting names the bandmate he really hates. It is what makes that kind of claim so powerful in the public imagination. It suggests an unfiltered confession. A final, late-in-life truth bomb. The rock star, older now, no longer caring about diplomacy, finally saying what is supposedly always felt. But the problem with finally is that it ignores a quieter reality. Sting, Copeland, and Summers have all spoken about their conflicts for years. In documentaries, interviews, and behind-the-scenes footage, they acknowledged the intensity. They joked about it. They grimaced about it. They described it in ways that are sometimes affectionate and sometimes unsettling, and in most of those real accounts, the language isn't they hate. It's difficult. It's combustible. It's we fought. It's we weren't friends. Those words matter, because hate is a simple story. Hate gives the audience a villain and a hero, but what if the truth is darker because it's more ordinary? What if it's not hate, but something that can feel worse? Unresolved resentment between two people who know they were great together and still can't forgive what it cost. If Sting were to name anyone, if he were to point to one person as the source of the most painful friction, history suggests the world would expect him to say Stewart Copeland. Not because Stewart is uniquely bad, but because the Sting-Copeland dynamic has always been the loudest. The most documented. The most raw. Stewart has been outspoken for decades. Is the type who will tell you the truth as he sees it, even if it's ugly, even if it makes him look ugly too. Sting, on the other hand, has often presented a more controlled exterior. He chooses his words carefully. He frames conflict with a kind of distance. That difference alone can create decades of misunderstanding, because when one person vents, and the other person stays polished, the polished one gets cold. The loud one gets cold unstable. And neither of those labels captures what's really happening, two men processing the same past with completely different emotional languages. That is another factor people ignore, tanto inte erase band dynamics. It embalms them. When you're young and fighting in the studio, you think it's temporary. When you're older and looking back, you realize those fights were the relationship. Those moments weren't the cracks in the story. They were the story, and fans, especially fans of iconic bands, don't want the messy truth. They want closure. They want a final statement that organizes the chaos into something understandable. So he really hates him becomes a shortcut. A way to explain why the magic stopped. A way to explain why reunions are tense. A way to explain why, even when they stand on stage together again, there can be a stiffness behind the smiles, as if each man is calculating how much of himself is willing to risk in public. Reunions are supposed to heal legends. Sometimes they expose the scar tissue. When the Police reunited for a massive tour decades after their peak, it sold bib in pure celebration. A victory lap. A love letter to the past, but anyone who watched closely could sense it. The professionalism was flawless, the music was sharp, the crowd was ecstatic, and beneath it all, there was a tension that felt familiar. Not new anger, but old patterns, because success doesn't fix the original imbalance. It just makes the imbalance more expensive. If Sting had truly said he had one bandmate, it would be shocking not just because it's harsh, but because it would be a simplification of a relationship that has always been complicated. And complexity is the one thing celebrity culture hates more than anything else. In the world of fame, you're supposed to be either best friends forever or enemies for life, but the most realistic, most painful truth is that you can love what someone helped you build and still not be able to stand them. You can respect their talent and resent their presence. You can owe them your legend and still feel like they stole something from you. Dime, peace. A sense of ownership. And in a band like the Police, where each member was exceptional, the resentment doesn't come from weakness. It comes from strength colliding with strength. Imagine being Sting, watching the band become synonymous with your voice and your songs, while also feeling constantly challenged, questioned, pushed. For some artists, that's energizing. For others, it feels like being undermined in your own house. Now imagine being Stuart Copeland, watching your band become increasingly identified with the singer, watching the songwriting credit determine the financial reality, feeling your own creative contributions reduced in the public narrative to the drummer as if the architecture of the sound was incidental. And imagine being Andy Summers, the third point in the triangle, often quieter in the mythology, but essential to the signature. The one whose guitar tone and harmonic choices helped make the Police sound like the Police, not like any other band chasing the same era. If you want to understand why the question "who does Sting hate" captivates people, it's because it's really asking something else. When a band is that iconic, who gets to own the story? Because ownership is what all of this comes down to. Not just money. Not just credit. Ownership of the narrative. The singer is usually the face. The world gives the singer the myth. The other members are often treated like supporting characters, even when the music proves they were not. That imbalance can poison everything. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way that makes you tired. In the way that makes every compliment feel like an insult because it's incomplete. Your band is amazing starts to sound like your band is Sting. And over decades, that can curdle into bitterness that no reunion photo can hide. So let's talk about the real reason this story keeps resurfacing, no matter how many times the band members try to explain it in more nuanced terms. Because fans don't just consume music. They consume relationships. They want to believe the chemistry they hear was friendship, they want to believe the harmonies were love, they want to believe the tightness of the band means they were tight as people. And when you tell them the truth, that the band could be miserable, that the members could be at each other's throats, they feel betrayed. Not by the band, but by the idea that art is supposed to be made in joy. But some of the best art is made in conflict. Some of it is made because of conflict, and that's where the darkness lives. What if the thing that gave you everything also took something from you that you can never get back? Your youth, your privacy, your ability to trust. Your ability to sit in a room with the people who helped change your life without feeling your chest tighten. When people say Sting hates his bandmate, they're not just hungry for drama. They're trying to make sense of the cost of greatness, because the Police wasn't just a band. It was a pressure chamber that turned three men into icons, and icons don't get to be normal people afterward. Even now, decades later, every question asked in an interview is a small act of reopening. Every reunion rumor is a hook pulling at old wounds. Every time a journalist asks about tensión, it's asking them to relive the parts they survived by refusing to think about too deeply. And the older you get, the more you understand a brutal truth: some conflicts don't resolve. They just go quiet, not because forgiveness arrived, but because energy ran out. That's why the idea of a 73-year-old Sting naming someone he really hates feels plausible. People assume age brings honesty. That at some point, politeness collapses and the real feelings spill out, but age can also bring something else. Perspective. At 73, you don't necessarily want revenge. You want peace. You want to stop carrying old anger like it's part of your identity. You want to remember what mattered and let the rest fade, which is why, if Sting ever spoke about a bandmate with real harshness, the most surprising part wouldn't be the name. It would be the fact that he still cared enough to hate, because hate requires heat, and the police already burned through so much of their heat in the years when it mattered most. What remains now is what remains for many people who survive intense partnerships, a complicated respect, a lingering ache, and a memory that refuses to become simple. If there is one thing the police proves, it's that three people can create something immortal without ever learning how to treat each other gently. The music is still there, clean and alive, untouched by whatever happened in the studio after midnight, untouched by the arguments about arrangements and credit, untouched by the moments when someone walked out of a room and slammed a door hard enough to shake the walls. The audience hears every breath you take and thinks of obsession dressed as romance, a song that itself feels like a confession of something toxic and beautiful. They dance the message in a bottle like it's hope. They sing Roxanne like it's desire and regret. They don't hear the human price behind the precision, they don't see the exhaustion behind the perfection, they don't feel the loneliness that can exist even inside a trio that conquered the world. And maybe that's the most haunting conclusion of all, not whether Sting hates Stuart Copeland, not whether he resents Andy Summers, not whether any headline is true, but that a band can sound like unity while being held together by tension, and that the people who made that unity possible may never fully escape the emotional damage of having been that close, that successful, and that incompatible, because the real story isn't about hate. It's about what happens when you build a legend with people you can't live with, and then spend the rest of your life being asked to smile about it.